Thank you, Giovanna, and thank you to Ministry of Space for organizing this, and Heinrich Boll for bringing me over. Thank you all for being here. It's really great to speak and participate in this conference. I'm learning about Serbia, I'm learning about Belgrade, but the context that I know the best is the United States and specifically New York. So that's going to be sort of the background that I'll be speaking from, and then I think our discussants are going to bring in more of the regional and local context. But as I'm speaking, I don't have a PowerPoint. So I would like you to imagine your local context in what I'm discussing. And maybe what you see is the same thing happening in Belgrade as is happening in New York. And maybe what you see is something actually quite different. But I want you to be picturing where you come from, the cities that you've lived in, and how the ideas that I'm bringing up resonate or are consonant with your local experience. So as an overview, I'm going to talk about the kind of affordable housing problem in the New York and US context, some of the structural conditions for why it exists, some of the alternatives that are being fought for, both in a practical way and in a more idealistic way, and then the kind of vulnerabilities and opportunities that are present in the current moment. So the first thing to say is just that housing unaffordability is basically a universal condition at this point. Certainly in New York, where I come from, all over the United States, but basically in most places around the world. The pandemic has changed some of the conditions and especially some of the statistics that I used in my book to make this case. So I'm going to be presenting some sort of pre-pandemic data, and then we can update it a little bit later. So my book was published in 2019. I wrote the first draft of it in 2017, which means most of the data came from 2016. So as of 2016, we had hit a record rate of home sales in the United States. So more and more homes were being bought and sold, and less of the residents owned them. So there was a record high level of absentee landlordism. And the kind of model absentee landlord in American culture is like an older couple who worked and used their savings to buy a house, and now they rent that out and they're really nice to their tenants. That barely exists, if it ever existed. Much more it is large banks, hedge funds, private equity firms that are buying up a growing share of real estate, to the point that the largest private landlord in the world is Blackstone, a private equity group based out of New York City. So renting was becoming more and more common over homeownership in the United States, and at the same time rents were rising. So over the last 2 decades, the average new rent, so the rent on a vacant apartment, more than doubled. At the same time, wages stayed basically flat, especially for the bottom half of wage workers. So workers' wages are staying flat, but the rents are going up and up and up, especially as they're forced to move more and more frequently. So that means that the percentage of people's paycheck that's going toward housing costs is rising really exponentially. The norm in the United States is to be rent burdened, which means in our context paying more than 30% of your income in rent. In New York City, more than 2 million people are severely rent burdened, which means paying more than half of their income in rent. And it's basically like a giant cash transfer from your boss to your landlord every month that you keep a minority share of after you've lost so much of it in rent. And so as wages are flat and housing costs are rising, we also see a rise in homelessness. So the year that I wrote my book, it was estimated 2 million people in the United States went homeless at some point in a year, and an additional 7 million people were living in severely overcrowded conditions. So 2 to 3 households in what should be one person's or one household's home, or couch surfing, going from place to place without a stable address. So that's 9 million people in total who are basically housing precarious or homeless. There's less and less of a public sphere in housing in the United States, really since the mid-1970s and especially the 1980s. So we had a period of intense neoliberalization in the United States, just as there was in this country and as there was in the UK and many other places around the same time in response to the same global structural macroeconomic forces. So we had the budget for our public housing cut by 80% during the decade of the 1980s, and only now is there talk of reinvesting to bring it back. And in the 40 years since, the condition of public housing deteriorated, and there was an ideological shift that public housing, government-owned housing, was automatically bad housing. Because government housing became bad housing, because the government failed to keep maintaining it. But the fact that the government wasn't maintaining it was sort of spoken of softly, and the fact that the conditions were terrible was spoken of very loudly. And so in the public consciousness, public housing came to be known not only as poor people's housing, but as bad housing. There was a program to demolish public housing that was taken up in many cities in the United States, notably not in New York City, where I come from. We maintained our public housing. But now really the only options for getting more money into the system involve various ways of privatizing the public housing stock, either letting in private management or building private housing on the grounds of public housing. We have in New York City, not nationally, a rent control system. So a system that keeps the rents from rising too much in the private housing stock. And that applies to about half of the private housing. So it's an enormous system. But in the years of the 1980s and especially the 1990s, even the early 2000s, the state government cut back on those programs very intensely, which allowed landlords not only to raise rents, but eventually, once the rents were high enough, to exit the system altogether. And so we lost a lot of affordable housing that way. Again, in this kind of attrition, housing by housing way that you could not notice if you weren't paying attention, rather than all at once, which would have sparked a massive uprising. Notably, and I'll return to this later, we did actually fix almost all of the retrenchment that happened in the 1990s through a massive mobilization 2 years ago in New York City. So there is hope. We've also seen a tremendous amount of luxury housing development in New York City and in many places in the United States and around the world. And through a process that Danielle mentioned before called financialization of housing, we've even seen housing that isn't all that luxurious become very expensive and a way of turning the ownership of an asset into the availability of a tremendous amount of credit. So there's luxury development that you may have seen pictures of in New York City, areas like what's called Billionaires Row on 57th Street, not that far from where I live, which has a row of 8 massive, very skinny, high-rise developments. Almost all of them are condominiums. If you look at them at night, very few have the lights on. They are almost entirely investment properties to purchase and then resell rather than to live in and to either park or launder money in the meantime. There was a recent book that came out called Icebergs, Zombies, and the Ultra Thin. That's about the architecture of financialized capitalism. Icebergs are a model of luxury housing that's popular in the United Kingdom, where there are strict height caps on construction. And so if you have billions of dollars, you channel it into the ground and you build giant pools and wine cellars and basically mansions underground, even though your building only goes up 2 or 3 stories. So that's the icebergs. The zombies are these buildings that nobody lives in, that are built to look like urban vitality, but are actually, sort of the dead, barely living. And then the ultra thin are these buildings that are incredibly narrow and high-rise, which are kind of an engineering wonder, but enable luxury construction in spaces that are already fairly tightly built. So the latest one to go up in New York City has a ratio of width to height of 1 to 23. It is the most slender building in the world. The Empire State Building, which people might be more familiar with, has a ratio of 1 to 3. This is 1 to 23. So that's kind of like the easy to see version of luxury development and financialization. But the regular old housing stock in New York has also been deeply financialized, with landlords essentially using the banks, using the buildings as banks. So let's say that you own a 5-story rent-stabilized apartment building with 50 units, and the rent brings in enough money to cover the mortgage and the expenses. What the landlord will do is go to the bank and say, I want to refinance my mortgage. I want to take all the money out of the building and get a new mortgage. And we will assume now that my building is worth more because the city has gentrified, and someone will rent these rooms for more money if I can get rid of the people who are here now, who have been there for a couple generations or who are recent immigrants. The banks love this. It works. And so they go along with it. They give the landlord millions of dollars back that they had borrowed previously and repaid. And so the landlord now has tens of millions of dollars under the premise that they can either sell the building for more money than they bought it for, or that they can get higher rents and higher profits by disinvesting from the maintenance of the building or raising the rents, or both in some cases. And so this process has worked. The landlords get all that money. They then either keep it or they buy more buildings with that money that they pulled out of the one building. So you take the money out of one building, you buy 2 new ones. Then you go to the bank on that mortgage and you say, let me get the money back out of that. I'm going to buy 2 more, and so on and so on. And you end up with the financialization of normal real estate, not ultra-luxury real estate, again, under the premise that the rents will rise and the value of the property will rise. And you have the concentration of ownership in a smaller and smaller group as those landlords with access to this capital buy up the rest of the housing stock. Checking time. Okay. So all of this suggests that there's a lot of money to be made in housing. There's a lot of money to be lost for renters and low-income owners, and there's a lot of money to be made for condo buyers and developers and landlords. This is borne out by surveys of how investment is channeled around the world. As of when I wrote my book, which again was a few years ago now, but I think this data holds up, global real estate was worth $217 trillion, which if we think about that in a more universal currency is 36 times the value of all the gold that's ever been mined in the world. If you took all the gold that's ever been collected, you put it all together, you valued that, real estate would be worth 36 times that amount. It makes up 60% of the world's hard assets. So 60% of what is invested in something you can touch is real estate. And much of what's invested in something you can't touch is a derivative of real estate. So it's a group of mortgages that got pooled together into a bond that you can buy as a financial derivative. So 60% of the world's money is invested in real estate. Of that, 3/4 is housing. And of that, 80% is in cities. I know I just threw a lot of percents out there, so I'll repeat it. 60% of the world's investment capital is in real estate. 75% of that money that's in real estate is in housing. 80% of the world's housing is in cities. So our homes in cities are basically the majority share of the world's capital. And our overburdened rent is the way that the capitalist class worldwide is reproducing its wealth. It can be a very personal process, but it's also existing at this very abstract way. So then the question is, why is this happening? Why is so much money being invested in real estate? And honestly, I think that's a good question to ask Aaron Beninoff, who's here to talk on Thursday. He's a better economist than I am. But I think we can look at a number of features that are all kind of contributing to this, and in some ways are manifestations of the same thing. So in a lot of countries, yes, in the US, but not only in the US, we've had about 30 years of financial deregulation, of loosening the rules about how and where capital can be invested, how it can be moved, what you can do with bank-owned assets. And as we have deregulated, we've allowed for more and more quote-unquote creative uses of capital, which is usually more exploitive, more secretized, and more securitized, so distributed internationally. And real estate becomes a very good place to put capital at a time when more traditional investments are not producing anywhere close to the same returns. So Treasury Bonds in the United States are sort of the simplest thing that you can do with your money. We haven't had high returns on those bonds in at least since 2008, really longer, like since 2000. And so saving your money doesn't make sense. You want to put it into something that turns something around very quickly. We also did quantitative easing in the United States, and some other central banks did the same, which was basically producing money on a spreadsheet and saying, now our economy is larger. And when the Federal Reserve Bank does that, they basically increase the amount that every bank can own of fake money. It's all fake money, but of especially fake money. And so now the banks have a lot more money, and they're supposed to invest that money. They're not supposed to hold on to it. And when that happened, it was in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. There was a lot of bank foreclosure, of banks taking over people's homes when they couldn't pay their mortgages. And so we just had a lot more ammunition for that kind of financialization and housing takeover. We also have massive urbanization programs, like I'm told on the waterfront in Belgrade, in many parts of the world that are basically acting as sops for capital. They are absorbing surplus capital that wouldn't otherwise know what to do with itself, if we want to humanize capital that way. We have predatory equity funds, private equity funds, that are basically looking around the world for what they consider to be undervalued resources. So things that they think they can make more money off of than is being made right now. And yes, that's luxury housing, but that's much more moderate income housing that they think they can gentrify. So that would be like the rent-stabilized housing in New York City that big investors are buying up under the premise that they can make it more expensive than it is right now. We consider it home, they consider it an undervalued asset. We've got economic polarization happening all over the world, with a small number of people getting much richer, as Danielle showed us in that chart of the billionaires during the pandemic. And when you have that kind of money in your personal wealth, real estate is a kind of sensible way of dealing with that. First of all, you can spread it all over the world, so that if there is political chaos in one country, political chaos usually meaning victory for us, then they don't have to worry about their property being expropriated or taxed at a very high rate. So if you spread it out, you buy a condominium in New York, and one in Vancouver, and one in Sao Paulo, and one in Mumbai, and one in Belgrade, then whatever happens in the world, your investments are probably growing, and they are very easy to get rid of, especially because nobody lives in them. They are just as easy to sell as a stock or a bond. And then the most macro of macroeconomic explanations is that the rate of profit tends to fall, as we say, and that has been the case for a while in the capitalist economy, certainly since the 70s, but then accelerating more recently in industrial production in the first and second world. And so as those kinds of investments become less profitable, there is more and more money to be made from what we call capital gains, which is the money you can make from owning a thing. In this case, real estate. It could also be art, right? So there was a simultaneous boom in art sales as the sales in luxury condos were going up, because it's another thing that you can buy that's worth whatever you say it's worth, because it's worth whatever you can sell it for. And then there's basically an existing market for it. So in addition to thinking about those kind of like tenant protection and land use policies, we can adopt policies that facilitate the transfer of private land and buildings into public or collective ownership. And again, this is tricky in a US legal context where private property rights are pretty highly valued, but there is a history of it in various ways. Much of that involves landlords who become delinquent in their bills. So landlords who are no longer paying property taxes. Cities do have the power to take those buildings and can basically give them back over to the tenants to run as limited equity cooperatives, to run as affordable housing that is owned by the residents and strictly regulated to make sure that they don't become just expensive and exclusionary forms of housing. We have also the possibility of what's called in the US eminent domain, which is when the government basically purchases private property and is supposed to put it toward a public use. This has a terrible history in the US. It's basically just been an excuse for highway expansion and displacement of racial minorities. The tool is not the problem, though, right? We can use the same tool to expropriate property. We just have to pay for it. We can't do what's happening right now in Berlin and sort of that model of expropriation. We don't have the legal ability to do it. We can, however, just basically purchase private property and take it off of the market. There's a large history in New York City of alternative housing models that can be produced once you've done one of those two things. Either taking existing housing and turning it into affordable housing, or taking land, knocking down what's there and building something new. There is a model called zero equity co-ops, which is usually for new construction in New York City, but sometimes for conversion. And in that model, the residents of a building own it collectively. So you don't own your individual apartment, you own a share in the building that is a proportion of how much space you take up. You buy it at a low price that is subsidized by the government, and when you sell it for what you bought it for, plus inflation, and maybe an adjustment if you replace the floors or something like that. Maybe you can recoup that money, but no more. That's a zero equity co-op. This is a great form of housing in that it is basically fully decommodified. There's no money to be made on it, but also very highly democratized. So if we think of social housing usually on three bases: decommodification, democracy, and deep affordability. The zero equity co-op model is always two of those things and sometimes all three. It's not always deeply affordable. It depends on how much subsidy is available from the government to make it so. But it is always democratic and it is always decommodified. There's also a model of limited equity cooperatives, which allows you to keep some of the money when you sell it, but not all of it. So the kind of housing that my partner and I live in, you buy it and it's affordable, and you sell it to someone who is in the same class status as you when you bought it, and you can only make 50% of the profit. The additional 50% goes back into the cooperative and is reinvested in the buildings, which makes for much lower monthly costs and is a pool of money to fall back on if you need major repairs to the building. So that's a model that's slightly less decommodified, but still democratic, and also less affordable, but more affordable than the common market. So the housing that we live in costs about half of what the market price is for housing in the area. We have for-profit housing that is subsidized by the government. This is not a great model. It often ends up costing the government much more than it should because it includes the profit making for the landlord, but it's not bad for the tenant who gets to live in usually fairly nice housing because other people are paying full market rate for it, and they get it at a subsidized rate. And of course, we also have public housing, which is fully owned and managed by the government. The residents rent from the government, and they pay 30% of their income. So as their income goes up, their rent goes up. As their income goes down, their rent goes down. This model is perfectly good as long as you maintain the buildings, and is a disaster if you don't. So there's nothing wrong with the model as long as you have the political power to maintain the money for the upkeep of the building. If you lose that, you end up in a situation where very poor people live in very bad housing. So how do we get this kind of housing? Like I said, the public can directly buy it and then basically take the loss and operate it as social housing thereafter. The public whether that's city government, national government, or even certain kinds of NGOs, can also buy debt. And this is maybe more complex than I have time for, but there is a way of purchasing the debt on a property rather than purchasing the property outright, especially when the landlord has fallen behind on their debt to the city. And so the city can buy that debt, or even members of the public can buy that debt, and then foreclose on the landlord. So basically, now we own the debt, the landlord owes us the money. If they can't pay it, we take the property. So that's a much cheaper way of getting the property. It doesn't always work out that way, but it is a way that's available. We can also institute right of first refusal laws, which says that when a building goes for sale, some entity should have access to it before the private market. That entity can be in a sort of series of steps. Maybe first the tenants have the right to buy. And if they exercise their right to buy, they get a subsidy from the government if they turn it into one of these zero or low equity models, and then it's permanently affordable. Could be that the tenants aren't in a position to buy it or don't want to manage the housing themselves. They can designate a nonprofit to be the buyer as the second option. Maybe as a third, or maybe even as a first, the city could have the right to buy it and operate it as public housing. That is currently illegal in the United States, but we could change the law and make that illegal. It might be possible in other national contexts. In any case, we don't have to let the private market be the first buyer every time a property is sold. And if you remember where I started, property is selling at a very, very fast rate. If we introduce this mechanism, one of two things would happen. Either they would stop selling the property all the time because they'd be afraid that the public would buy it, or the public would buy a whole lot of property and convert it into affordable housing. We can also think about things that aren't currently housing and turn them into housing. I'm running low on time, so I won't spend much time on this, but I worked on a campaign this past year to convert vacant hotels in New York City. Because of the pandemic, there were no tourists and a lot of hotels are going out of business. We passed a law to convert a lot of them into permanently affordable housing. They are small rooms, but they are already wired as living spaces, and there's a lot that can be done with them. Okay. I said I would talk about taxes before. I don't want to get too bogged down in that, but we can use the mechanism of taxation to attack speculation. So we can put taxes on the sale of homes that sell for much more than they were bought for. We can put taxes on the sale of homes that are being purchased at much more than affordable levels. We can tax warehouse properties that are bought but not live in. All of these are ways of using the existing tax system to make speculation more expensive. You don't want to drive a social housing program with taxes on speculation, though, because that assumes that speculation will continue, and you run out of money for your social housing if you actually do the job of killing it. So you want that money to be extra money on top of what you're already raising from progressive income taxes and other forms of taxation. Okay, in the last few minutes I want to look beyond the limits of the national constitution where I live and think about what more we can imagine. And so the principles, I would argue, at least first principles, and we can think about more principles after this. Public stewardship of planning. So right now, planning is an ostensibly public function that is functionally controlled by the real estate industry. Anytime you have that much private ownership of land and buildings and that much investment capital riding on local planning authority, there's very little ability for it to be fully democratized. That doesn't mean just sort of inviting public comment on a plan that's already been made, and it also doesn't mean every community decides for themselves, because that tends to just make richer communities richer and poorer communities stay poorer. It means redistributing the power within cities such that those who have basically been able to control the planning system for generations no longer have that power, and those who have been excluded from it are in the driver's seat. The second principle is socialized land. There is no reason that land should be privately owned. Nobody created it in the first place. and yet ownership of it gives monopoly power to the future development of cities. So for any of what I just talked about to work, it's all a workaround for the fact that we, the public, don't own the land. If we, the public, own the land and we, the public, control the planning, then the possibilities are virtually endless. The last thing to think about is a kind of radical form of regionalism, of not thinking within the boundaries of the neighborhoods as the real estate industry has drawn them, but not even as the city as the municipal government has drawn them, and certainly not the nation state as the borders have been drawn previously. We need to be able to mobilize popular efforts that ignore those boundaries and that look instead at ecological boundaries of planning, right? So what is the watershed for this local area? Where are our resources coming from and how far are they traveling? Those are the scales at which we should be planning, because if we don't, then basically capital is going to plan at those scales and we're going to be stuck, fighting for the neighborhood while we lose the world. It's very difficult to think about taking on the real estate state. I said it's worth 36 times the value of all the gold that's ever been mined. That's not an easy prospect. But there are vulnerabilities in the system that we should think about as basically our openings. So the first thing to think about is that all of that money that's being put into real estate is riding on the fact that rents will rise and property values will rise and land values will rise, right? It's not being put into into real estate as a sort of stable mechanism in which nothing changes and housing becomes more affordable and everybody loves the city. The premise is it's going to become more expensive for everybody. Anything that we do to arrest that challenges the underlying assumption of the majority of capital investment in the world. So the more and more across space that we can attack the idea that it's natural for housing to become more expensive over time instead of less expensive over time, challenges the ability of capital to reproduce and grow at a global scale. There's also a tremendous amount of debt that's put into every real estate project in the world. Real estate is almost never paid for upfront. That's true at the scale of the homeowner who usually buys with a mortgage. That's true at the scale of the landlord who buys the building. They also buy with debt. It's true of the developer who never has all of the money up front that they're expected to repay. It all comes in debt and it's all repaid over time. So $216 trillion in real estate investment probably assumes $750 trillion in debt. That's a lot of money riding on the fact that we will not move, or that we will move, that we will move, that we will pay more in rent or in housing costs over and over and over again in every city around the world. And so if we can arrest that possibility through the means that are available to us right now, through rent control, through taxation, through taking private property and turning it into social housing, it's all right. Then that debt is not realized. If that debt is not realized and repaid, then the owners of all this investment are in deep trouble. And when the owners of 60% of the world's assets are in crisis, there's a lot of possibility that's opened up. There's also a lot of bad that can come of that. So I don't want to pretend that nobody would be hurt if the global real estate market fell apart. We have to be ready for the possibility that what we're doing could actually spike the global economy, and then be damn well prepared to grasp that opportunity and rebuild in a drastically different direction. If we don't, the forces of capital will just sort of recreate themselves, and that's basically what happened in 2008. The entire world gorged itself on real estate speculation, blew up, and then reinvested in real estate speculation as a successful vehicle out of those crises. So that crisis is still with us. And so how do we build up that capacity? I think it's exactly what Giovanna said. At first, we need to repoliticize housing, which also means repoliticizing planning, which means repoliticizing the city, which means repoliticizing everything, basically, right? So not taking anything for granted as the natural way of things, but doing the popular education, doing the organizing to show that in fact the way we live is entirely socially constructed and could have been constructed in a very different way. So it means building up movements around housing among low-income homeowners, among tenants, among public housing residents, to fight to protect what they have, but also to go bigger. Usually the tendency is a sort of preservationist one. We're going to keep what we have and we're going to keep out the bad guys who want to change it. That's maybe a good way in, but it can never be the end of the story because the status quo is massively unjust for most of the world. And if all we win is preserving what we have right now, then we're a pretty pathetic radical movement. So scaling up from there, we also need community planning movements. So thinking about how do we want to reshape the city and making demands of the planners that come from a grassroots movement. We need movements for public land, for public sovereignty over land use decisions, and to get the fucking cars off the street because they're destroying the world. So none of this is easy. I don't want to pretend that, just because there are vulnerabilities in global real estate, tomorrow we're going to win, but all of it is possible, and I think it's very useful for us to be, acting at the local scale of our neighborhood and our city, but thinking about how this is all tied into a global circuit of capital investment. If we don't do anything about that global circuit of capital investment, it's going to be very hard to hold on to any victories that we win at the municipal level, let alone the national level. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Another question, why 1 million and what's stopping the state from expanding into a larger number of customers?
Yeah, so why are we at 1 million and why has it shrunk over time rather than expanded? So in the New York system, buildings that are newer than 1974 are generally not covered. So that's the first thing, is it applies to the older housing stock. Some newer buildings are brought in, but usually on a temporary basis. And the justification for this is if we restricted rents on new development, it would limit the amount of new construction in the city. So that's the first thing. The second thing is they added all these ways to get out of rent control by raising your rent past a certain threshold, and then by upon vacancy, when the tenant moves, the next tenant who moves in, they are no longer rent controlled. The landlord can charge whatever they want. They don't have to renew their lease. We got rid of that 2 years ago. We got rid of the mechanism to take them out, and we got rid of most of the mechanisms to raise rent other than the sort of ones that are actually essential to the operation of the building. The other thing we won, though, is the ability for more places in New York State to move into this system. And so we are now organizing for smaller cities around the state to go through the legal process to join rent stabilization. That will be extremely important politically, because if it's not just a New York City issue, we can do much more at the state level by uniting tenants who live in New York City with tenants who live in Buffalo, which is the next largest city in New York State, but is all the way at the Canadian border. It's very far away. But if we can be united in one system, then we can put pressure on the state government together. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes.
Just a short question, sorry. Thanks a lot, very great presentation. I know you asked us in the beginning to mention the context which we know, and I live in Belgrade, but I lived for quite some time in Berlin, and I follow the situation there, of course, with the rent freeze, rent control system there that was constitutionally challenged and now brought down. I think everybody knows the story, more or less. And the argumentation was mostly always to say, if we need more construction, right? Because the more offer we have in housing, the better it will be for the price development, because the price then will go down. But there wasn't, probably you agree that there was no alternative models to suggest it in saying how about actually trying different mechanisms to bring down the price rather than new construction. But the main argument was always, if we radically rent control, if we cap the rent per square meter in the city, then it will actually kill new investment, and that actually means that a lot of housing stock will not be maintained and will not be reinvested in. And according to you, I mean, one thing that I took away from your lecture, but I just wanted to double check it, is that you say actually we should oblige the cities, the public, to make that reinvestment and make that maintenance investment that nobody talks about actually.
Yes, that's right. So all of those mechanisms are real. If a city's population is growing and its housing stock is not growing and there is no rent control and there is no social housing alternative, of course the rents will go up. But we are basically forced into a discussion where all of those preconditions are assumed to be natural. That rent controls don't exist, that social housing models don't exist, that we can't build from the bottom up rather than the top down, right? The assumption is always you build what the market wants to build, and that will expand the number of luxury housing that is available, and then the middle class will move into the housing that the rich used to occupy, and the rich will move into the new luxury housing. This is a model that has been shown to be effective over a 30-year period, but is certainly not doing anything to meet like the needs of a homeless person right now. And also is not necessarily true anymore if the purpose of the new luxury housing is purely speculation, or even mostly speculation, which is the case now. It doesn't filter in the same way. And so simply allowing the market to fix itself ignores the fact that the market has been so speculative, has become such a speculative vehicle, rather than primarily a means of providing housing to people who need it. So we need alternatives. So what you're saying is the rhetorical debate that we get: if you put in rent control, then there won't be investment in the properties. Well, what do we do about that? We could mandate that if you don't invest in the properties, we're going to take the properties. So that would mean a serious system of inspection, right? So probably more than once a year, every unit of housing would have to have a municipal housing check to make sure that there isn't peeling lead paint, that there isn't asbestos, that there isn't mold, that there isn't rats or other vermin. And if there are, the city can do one of two things. Either it can put a very steep fine on the landlord and allow the landlord time to fix the problem, pay the fine, and then go on with their business. The city can fix it and charge the landlord, which is even better because the tenant gets immediate relief, and now the landlord has municipal debt. The great thing about municipal debt is that the city decides what they're going to do about it. So if the landlord doesn't repay the debt to the city, it's not some bank that will foreclose on the property. It's the city of Berlin or New York or Belgrade or wherever else, and they can do with it what the public demands. So that could actually be a sort of non-reformist reform, right? We talk about building code maintenance as a kind of boring thing compared to, the construction of new public housing. But if you think about it as a step toward a mechanism for the city to take back housing that is currently private and to turn it into permanently affordable, decommodified, and democratic housing, you might actually have a faster production of social housing that way than through a demolition and reconstruction program, which we don't have the power for, at least in my context in New York City.
That's if the city cares.
That assumes the city cares. And the fact of the real estate state is the city not only doesn't care, the city is on the other side. So all of this, there's no point in, so I laid out all the things that the city can do, right? That's exactly the point. No city is doing all of these things. Why is no city doing all of these things? They can, it's constitutional, it's not, illegal, because no city has no popular movement has gained sufficient power in any city to force a city to do this in the United States. In other countries perhaps, but in my local context not. And so what's the point of laying it all out? One is to not allow the politicians the excuse of there is no alternative. Yeah, there is an alternative, they're just not doing it. And then the second is a blueprint for what exactly are we organizing for. It's not just to sort of like maintain the status quo that we used to enjoy before the neoliberal period, it's a new way of doing things so that we can get even bigger victories.
I was asking you about when the rent cap was introduced and how did the owners react and can you tell us about the ownership structure? Because here in Belgrade, at least most of the people still own flats and they're really not like banks and corporations, but normal people own flats and they also resist these kinds of ideas because that means a burden on their budget and that's a way for them to compensate for low salaries or low pensions and so on. So I think I also wanted to ask you about taxes or anything similar to that, if this exists and like how, if the owners in any way organize or they unite to or lobby in different direction and how did that work throughout these years?
That's a great question, and I will attempt to answer it. And I also want to invite Sarah Davish to answer as well, because she did a thesis about Belgrade in New York that looked at some of these questions. So the first thing to say is, I think the first question you asked was, how did the landlords react to the rent cap?
Sorry, when was it introduced?
Yeah.
And how did they react?
It's a tricky question to answer because it has existed since World War I in some form, but it has disappeared at some times and come back at some times.
Yes, sir, this is why I was asking, because
Yeah.
after World War I, it also existed in the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenians.
Mhm.
It was abolished in 1922 because the lobby was, the rental lobby was really strong.
Mm-hmm.
And the change of the constitution also enabled that. So there was a rent cap, there was some protected tenants, all of that was abolished.
Right.
That we could also think about today because the conditions are really similar.
Yeah, right. So we had it introduced as a wartime measure. It was then continued. When the city tried to get rid of it, it was a time of a great deal of communist organizing in New York City, and also within the radical movement, a fair amount of unity on the tenant side and the workers' side. And so there was massive mobilizations, the likes of which we haven't really seen around housing issues since, that got those rent control laws reinstated. And interestingly enough, there were also communists who were elected to local city council in... Same here. And then we didn't for a long time have anything like that, and now we have the Democratic Socialists of America sending people into political office, which is very far from the Communist Party of New York in the 30s, but is like a closer version of that than we've had for some time. But the ownership structure here is quite different than in New York. In New York City, 2/3 of residents rent and 1/3 own. So the numbers should suggest that tenants are massively powerful, and in some ways they are. I mean, they have structures and institutions that have existed for many years, and we have an almost formalized tenant movement. But the real estate industry is also incredibly powerful, and you asked about lobbying. They have maybe 6 different lobby organizations that fight at the city and state level to preserve property rights and to fight back against some of the things that I've been fighting for many years. That said, we had a significant change in government, local government, a couple of years ago that enacted the most powerful new rent controls in about 50 years. And so in some ways the real estate industry is on the defensive and is trying to now make up for lost ground. But the fact is the numbers of voters are on the tenant side. And to the extent that we can organize that power, we need to. Sarah, do you want to add anything?
Well, I missed the question about when you refer to ownership structure over here, in the lobby.
I actually commented on the whole. I wanted to get a comparison between the two cases because what you just said I think is really important that you said that the voters are on the tenant side, and I don't think it's the same here, that we can come. So if we want to introduce rent caps, we also have to take a lot of care about these people who own flats, but they make use of them so they can compensate for their low incomes. So we really have to take that into consideration. Like, it's not the facts that we are having these discussions with, or that are on the opposite side of us. So I mean, it's going in that direction, but still, I think that we need to find ways to actually persuade these people that the rent caps will not damage their budgets. I think that we have, here we have loads of these kinds of problems that are actually, that we have two sides that are quite similar in their, let's say, class or status. So if a person who is not really a millionaire trying to evict someone, it's kind of, that it's not really that we're fighting corporations or we're fighting banks. And I think that maybe it would be interesting to hear more about how to, or like we can think more about how we can deal with these things, because we already have the law changed, and people should pay some taxes to the city, but everyone avoids it because they know that if this has to be paid, it will burden more the tenants, so the rent will actually rise. So I was thinking a lot about these things and these complexities, so I would like to hear more about the ideas that you have.
No, we were talking last night that the whole strata of the renters in the city is just a gray area, is unrecognized, and there is no base for advocacy when no rights and obligations are articulated. So, and this will probably be initiated by the state in order to get these people taxed. And from that point on, we can talk about advocacy and, yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. I just wanted to maybe just continue to what actually Ivana said. In Serbia, at least, I think it's probably the same in the region. Renting the flat is, in most cases, actually a social category. So people are renting because they own it, and they're trying to actually increase their tenant budget. But what we can think about instead of rent cap is actually housing subsidy, which is not actually targeting the landlord, but is putting the burden on the local self-government actually to provide housing support, financial support to people who are renting, who are in the situation that they need support to pay their rent. So maybe we can just actually switch the angle, but in the effect probably have the same result as we would have it with the rent cap. That's just, I don't know, maybe the idea.
I think that the city of Belgrade already suggested something like that. They even went further, like they wanted to rent empty flats from owners at market price, and then rent them to the people.
At this point, actually, they even have the obligation to introduce the housing subsidy, not just the Belgrade only, but pretty much every other sub-government in the country because of the law. But it's just not being implemented.
Yeah, but what I think, what I
Well, it's not just.
would like to talk about as a reproach to this is that we do not aim at lowering the rent in general. So if you as a city or as a state, if you agree to this and if you do this, then you do not stimulate in any way the lowering of rent. So there are only as many flats that you can rent from owners that are empty, and then you can sublet to people. So then I think that that this is a drawback for.
Look, I have several questions for you because you might know from mostly Sara, Ivan, and Danilo. What is the actual structure in Belgrade regarding the number of people who are tenants? And if you are aware of the percentage of people who are basically legally renting apartments instead of as some sort of direct spoken agreement? And also, what do you think, is it changing, how it's changing, to me it seems the boom of construction in Belgrade is creating a lot of property that to me looks like speculative investment. I mean, it seems a lot of it is empty and it is on a huge scale and on very different levels of luxuriousness. Some is just taking ground and building something. So what is like, are there perceived effects of this on the whole situation? But mostly I would like to know if you know any assessment of the numbers. And also thank you for it. It's been very informative and know very little of these subjects. But I was wondering, so thank you for the overview. I was wondering, when you were talking about the basically some of the sort of ground that you made that you think now lead to increasing the number of rent-controlled apartments over 1 million, for example. Where do you see them coming from? So what kind of properties and who are the actors who will be doing this and why? So I would like to know how this is. Thank you.
Do you want to answer the first question first?
I'm not sure actually we have the answer. About the numbers at least, I don't know, there are some estimates about
There are estimates that there are, what I found in the Socialized Land. Okay, I found that there in Belgrade there were 360,000 tenants. I think that's not, that is a lower number than it really is because people don't want to say this. And the number of people making legal agreements, I think we can talk about it.
Actually, you have a contract only if you're a company or a foreigner. That's actually two only cases where you're having a contract. Because if you're a foreigner, you have to have it because of the police registration, everything, and the companies are doing that. So this is a huge problem. There is no legal protection at all in these cases, and we can see that every day. And also it's completely invisible sector as well. We don't know who is there.
And about what is the new construction, new luxury construction for, we also don't have exact data, but we have, I remember while working in the city, the Republic Genetic Institute, they are in charge of registering every contract. They said that majority of buyers are foreigners, and it's again just as an investment. And then the data we had in the city, again, not very precise, says the same as French works the biggest real estate corporation in the country told me the same, and that is that 10% of all the buyers of newly built apartments are buying it for the purpose of solving their housing issues, meaning to live there. So it's just 10%, and then 90% would be speculation for investment.
And then I wanted to make sure I understood the question was about who are the rent-controlled landlords?
The new ones, so who are the new, where will they come from and why will they come now?
Yeah, so historically there's been a lot of sort of family businesses that are involved in this scale of landlording, which sounds more romantic than it is. I mean, the Trumps were a family business also. So these families build up sort of real estate empires, buying up buildings or whether, if they were around long enough, building them in the first place. But you did have some smaller owners who, in the last 20 years, 30 years, maybe 20 years, especially as the city has been gentrifying, as their properties are worth more, are selling to conglomerates. And they're selling to basically corporations who run these businesses. Some of them are those larger family businesses. Some of them are private equity funds or hedge funds or other funds who basically pull together a bunch of money and assets and then invest the earnings in various places and then send money back to the investor class in the first place. So you have, we don't have the same level of this as you see in, for example, California. In California, you have those kinds of firms buying up single-family houses and then operating them as rentals run by this massive corporation. We have a little of that in New York, but mostly because we don't have as many single-family homes, we have them buying up rent-stabilized buildings, which are usually between 10 and 50 apartments. And so the average portfolio for an owner is probably, I would say the average is probably 20 buildings for a like mid-sized real estate corporation in New York City. And so they've got 20 buildings. From that, they've got hundreds of apartments. Each one is sending in rent every month, and each one has a mortgage in all likelihood. So they want to have debt on these properties. They're not trying to get out of debt so that they can, live like a homeowner would. They want to be in debt so that they can have this relationship with the bank where they can cash out the amount that they put in, take a new, bigger loan, and then use that money to buy even more buildings over and over again. Does that make sense? No?
Yeah,
Okay.
It's just part of the question that I still don't know. It's when you say the numbers might grow now that some changes will be made. Where do they come from?
Got it.
The new potential people who will put their properties under rent control.
Yes.
Where are they coming from and why?
Got it.
Now? So that's
So the new areas of rent control will not be in New York City. They will be in other cities in New York State. So in any city has to basically show that they have what they call a housing emergency, which has a very technical definition, which is that there's less than 5% vacancy of available rental properties. So you have to do a survey of your housing stock, and you have to show that less than 5% of the housing that is in good enough condition to live in is actually being rented. I'm sorry, more than 95% of it is actually being rented. There's less than 5% vacancy. That's the legal justification for rent control in New York, is that tenants can't basically use their market power. If they've got a bad landlord who is charging them too much, they can't exactly pick up and move someplace else because there's so little vacancy. Most places in New York State that have high rents can also show that they have this vacancy crisis, and so then they will be opting in. Every building that is more than 5 apartments and that was built before 1974 will then be a part of this. The landlord doesn't have any say. That's the best part of it, is that it's not a landlord opt-in system. It's the voters decide that they want this, and then it happens. If it was a landlord opt-in system, I don't think it would work.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it means that you need to have argument for it in order to get rent control legislation. You need to have argument that the market is not working.
Right.
There is no supply.
Right.
And that's why.
Yeah, it does come down to the same market ideology in the first place, that if we had a normal functioning housing market, this wouldn't be the case. Whereas I think what we've seen is that this is what a normal functioning housing market looks like. Yeah.
Seems like maybe an area where there might be some overlap is illegal conversions.
Is what?
Illegal
Conversions? Yeah.
And so people in New York City who will have private homes converting their basements into apartments and then renting them out. And this is an area that was just a massive growth in the census counting.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering if
Yeah, so I can talk about that and then maybe people can reflect on what's going on here. It's basically an informalization of the housing stock and dealing with the fact that there is not necessarily a lack of housing as such, but a lack of housing that's affordable to low-income, especially immigrant workers. And so in many single-family homes in New York City, landlords or owners will become landlords, and they will convert a space in their house into an apartment, and is very often the basement. This is fine and good, except that it can be dangerous. It's not necessarily up to the building code maintenance that I'm saying is actually a key aspect of a good housing system. Sometimes they only have one exit. So if there's a fire and it blocks that exit, the tenant is trapped. So what we're trying to do is get public funding available to basically convert those informal apartments into safe and, formal apartments. But when they do that, so if the landlord takes that money, they have to then put it into rent control. So that's our way of getting some public benefit back. There's a risk involved in this, which is that the reason that it's so affordable in the first place is that it's informal. And if we formalize it, even with the rent control, it may not be as cheap as the workforce who needs it can afford. So that's the risk involved in it. But yes, as Sarah said, we had a large increase in our population this year in our census. We do a census every 10 years in the United States, and we just got the first set of results back from 2020. And everyone expected the population of New York City to go down because all the news stories were about people fleeing New York City during the pandemic. But in fact, we increased by hundreds of thousands. Most of that growth was the city now finding all these people who are living in basements and other informal housing structures that simply weren't being counted before.
Today we have Antonija Komazic from Right to the City Zagreb, and we have Danilo Đurđić, who will actually talk on behalf, in this occasion, on behalf of the housing equality movement. It's a recent collaboration in Belgrade, and he will talk about it. He will talk about it more. So what I would like to invite both of you to do is to reflect from your own experience and from your own practice, to reflect on what Samuel has mentioned, but also if you want to elaborate more on some of the questions that we talked in the discussion, in the previous discussion, for example, some of the specificities from this context, and also perhaps, I will ask maybe some additional questions. For now, you can have some 10 minutes or so to present some of your views, and then we'll again go into the discussion later.
Okay. Well, in the beginning, I would like to thank Samuel for his lecture. We are now building upon in this reflection. When we will try to give a perspective of our housing context here in this part of Europe, and which specifically is the similarity of our inheritance related to the housing stock we created and during the socialist Yugoslavia. And therefore, it's quite different from the U.S. context. Here in Croatia, but similarly to Serbia and the other southeastern countries of Europe, in Croatia only 1% of housing is publicly owned or managed. In Zagreb, 2% as a capital, but in the rest of the country, only 1%. So it has nothing to do. With.
Can you please repeat the number and what you said?
In Croatia, only 1% of total housing stock is publicly owned or managed, and in Zagreb it's only 2%. And of course, it's quite different than New York situation of 2/3 of inhabitants living in some kind of on rent schemes. In Croatia, the most of this so-called societal housing fund was privatized during the wars of the 1990s, and in a specific right to buy scheme that led big amount of society end up like private owners, and enabled what is now happening, some kind of classes, higher classes created at the basis of inheritance or buying of these societal housing stock for a really privileged price. That was originally that was some 25% of the real price of the property. People were allowed to pay, and this way becoming the owners of the flat, and at the moment we are counting that some 90% of citizens of Croatia are private owners. But it's at the same time it's some kind of statistical mistake, because the state is perceiving that number as if 90% of population are private owners, which is not true. But 90% of households are in private ownership, meaning that various generations live in the same flat, in the overcrowded situation, without really often without perspective of resolving their housing situation because of various economic factors. But at the same time, state is not perceiving the housing issue as something relevant for making different kind of housing, making different kind of progressive or more fair housing politics. This number is in correlation with the fact that enormous number of young people in Croatia are living to a very old age, are living with their parents. Some 80% of young people between 18 and 34 years live with their parents, and for a number of years we used to take a third place in European Union for this feature, and now the new findings from about 2 months ago say we are the first one in European Union by the number of young people living with their families, and at the same time we are as well leading in European Union for a number of short-term work contracts, which means a huge, really high level of precarious living conditions, which doesn't allow young people to resolve their housing needs only at the basis of their income. At the same time, the state, which I repeat, takes the 90% of people are private owners, just shaped took the direction of housing politics based on private property and market. So the state, just decided in some 20 years ago, decided to, work in correlation with banks, with developing a different scheme of very unfavorable for the citizens, very unfavorable and even toxic housing loans. Often in foreign currencies. For Croatia, it is a notorious case of a number of people in Croatia taking loans in Swiss francs without any kind of measures protecting protecting the stability of paying off this kind of loans, which is which damaged a huge number of relatively young people actually that were able to buy a flat through this kind of credits, of loans, and made them impoverished by the really volatile character of these loans, and as well provoked the biggest social movement in Croatia, having to do with housing issues, that were people who had this credit in Swiss francs organizing in making a legal making a legal resolution of this problem, and settling with the state to eventually regulate these loans. But it's quite a paradox, because a small amount of people in Croatia, young people, is still able to resolve their housing issues with bank loans. It's the only possibility of having a security of housing. The only possibility is through ownership, and the state doesn't invest almost anything in any kind of societal housing or public housing or non-profit housing, leaving everybody to resolve their housing issues on the market, be it buying a flat or renting, while the situation of tenancy is not completely unregulated, but quite unregulated. We do have a law on tenancy, but it's very outdated. It's from the year 1996. It was dedicated primarily to resolving a situation, of regulating a situation of the so-called protected tenants, that were people who, during this process of privatization of societal housing stock, didn't buy the flats they were living in, but they were left in the status of tenants. So this law is really inadequate for our needs. We as well have problems with the regulation through contracts, and the influence of touristification, of course, which, as in the other parts everywhere in the world, had a huge influence on the housing stock. In the years before crisis, we saw the growth of 30% of housing stocks in big cities like Zagreb, or on the coast of the long-term rental stock passing in short term, and this led to the rise of rent of some 11%. The actual tenants were left in an even more precarious position without possibility to find adequate flat, because most of them went to the short-term rentals, and in situation when they are responsible at the personal level to negotiate their tenancy position with their landlords without actual protection from the state, and some real implementation of the very scarce protection we do have in our tenancy law. But what we do right to the city Zagreb in terms of this regulation of tenancy, in the first place we are trying to inform tenants what are their possibilities and of protection based on the actual legal framework. And for this purpose, we edited and we analyzed existing tenant contracts and edited some kind of booklet for tenants with suggestions how to apply the existing legal framework, and some advices how to negotiate better with the landlords. And we even did some template of ideal contract, which we think we did it in collaboration with lawyers, and we think it in this situation enables tenants to protect better their status. And in the longer term, we are trying to inform different levels of government and advocate for a new tenancy law. And now but I can tell more about this in the discussion after Danilo. But we are part of the new municipal government in Zagreb, within which we are working for years on shaping our own housing politics. And now we believe we'll have opportunity to implement some of these solutions based on non-profit housing and bigger level of public housing in Zagreb.
Thank you. Danilo, maybe I can, because we do share the same genesis of the situation current and the privatization, and some of the also current situation in Serbia was touched upon in the previous. So maybe if you want to fill in.
Make it shorter.
No,
I'm kidding.
That was
No, of course, yeah, but I think pretty much actually the statistics are the same, so 98%, 98 point something.
The same.
Sorry?
Please repeat the same.
Yeah, so that's the situation over there, but other problems we have are actually related to the fact that housing is not really a political issue at all in Serbia. That's the main problem, I would say, and most of the issues we are dealing with when it comes to housing are actually the result of that. But before I start, actually, I would just actually like to mention this newly established collaborative called Housing Justice Movement, which consists of actually 5 different groups and NGOs. So it's Housing Center, it's the Ministry of Space, it's the Pograd i Grad, Krov nad glavom, and A11 Initiative for Economic and Social Rights. And we are trying, actually, we gathered there in an attempt actually to influence housing policy of the city of Belgrade, which is still not adopted. And the problem over there is that at this point there is no, not a national, we don't even have the national housing policy strategy, and the problem is that because of that there is no intervention at all actually in the housing market. Issue of unaffordability is happening even in cases of social housing, so it's not even on the market, but goes even wider in cases of people getting social housing as some kind of of the right. Housing stock is, as we mentioned, fully privatized. There is no enough apartments, I would say, for any kind of intervention in the market, and also there are no mechanisms for making an intervention to the market. We mentioned these housing subsidies, but that's only actually some opportunity we have in the legal system, which are never being implemented. As I mentioned before, and we already spoke about this problem with the deregularized housing market. Another issue is that this issue of affordability is not really being political issue at all. So we are not discussing this. Political parties are not discussing this as part of their programs. Some political movements are actually starting to do that, but that's actually just starting, I would say. People are not being mobilized around this idea, which is also another problem. So people are paying this unaffordable housing, actually struggling to find cheap enough space actually to live, but not struggling actually against these policies and these actually effects of the complete absence of the state intervention. And in some extent, actually, what is also interesting is that, as I mentioned, social housing, actually the number of social housing apartments is very low in Belgrade. Belgrade is the biggest in the capital, and it's a couple of thousands of apartments. And not all of them are actually made for social housing, but some of them are for non-for-profit rent, for people working with public administration again. So if you work with the city of Belgrade, you can get cheap housing in big housing estates built by the city of Belgrade. The problem in some cases we were seeing in our work is that even the monthly rent for social housing is higher than social benefit you get. And people are being actually at risk of forced evictions because of that, and hundreds of people are in this situation. Of course, this is not, again, being perceived as a problem that was made by the public authorities, but actually people are being now made as someone who doesn't want to pay, people who are lazy, who don't want to work, who want to live out of social benefit, and so on. So, and even in these cases, most of this publicly owned social housing, most tenants actually are in the position that they can buy at the end. So actually there is a right to buy even for social housing, which is completely insane and actually doesn't leave us any space for any kind of intervention, I would say. And I don't think actually there is anything specific more than this. Maybe there is, but maybe you can say. I would just, try to use this opportunity actually to try to think about this together. After we heard what Sam said, after we heard what's happening in Zagreb, and I think Serbia and Belgrade is, at least 5 to 10 years behind Zagreb even in this regard. And you are being the part of the ideas you are working on are being the part of the now mainstream political actor in the city. Again, Samuel was talking about tenants unions and actually different kinds of organizing in New York. Our perspective is, I would say, different in that regard. We cannot mobilize people. We are starting to organize now as a group of collaborative, actually, of different organizations and activists. So I would just like to use this opportunity actually to start, maybe if we can try to speak and think about the ways how we can shake these things up in Belgrade or in Serbia in general. So what should we work with social movements? Should we work with political parties? How to mobilize people? Like generally, what are the... So that's, just my kind of if I can pose a question.
No, of course. I actually wanted to propose similar thing for the discussion now. I think we all understand the context, but then maybe it would be nice to talk about referring to what Samuel was saying at the end of the lecture, what is to be done in this particular moment, and then what is to be done in terms of some more radical demands and policies. And also, I think, at least for Serbia, it's relevant. What can be done on a local level, like on a municipal level? What are the jurisdictions within this housing policies on a level of the city, and what are on the national level? So maybe these are all the things that we can, if you want to discuss. But yeah, what are all the things, the possible things that we can do? Now, and as Danila said, who else to invite to join forces? I will open the door as soon. Alright, so are there any comments, queries, suggestions?
We discussed this last night briefly, and I think it's a good question. The thing that Danilo just said, how to mobilize people. We were talking about reasons why people don't see that they should in any way engage with changing the housing system, which now belongs completely to the market. So I was thinking about maybe trying to form a tenants union in Serbia, and we were talking about some challenges and so on, and I think I have some ideas of why people are not ready, or they don't see that they should or that they can engage in these kinds of things, but I'm really interested in hearing other people's experiences, especially from other countries, like from New York again, or maybe someone mentioned Berlin, I think you did. So I'm really curious about how people react, and if you know, of course, when you want to form a tenants union, how you persuade people that you should do this. I think that there is, this is what Sarah mentioned before, and I agree with this. I think that the state should start regulating this so that we can unite, and I think it's we thought about this because it's unregulated. It's really difficult because we would have to engage in quarrels between individuals, and that's really tricky. And also, I belong to an organization that deals with eviction, so we actually have a conflict with the state and not with individuals, or like we always fear that they may frame some I don't know, like people that will beat the shit out of us, and when the police is there, it's easier because they can be observed, they're responsible to the citizens, and you know, like, if you engage in these really private relationships, then you can't really, it's more difficult to form a union. And if you do have a state that believes that it's so I'm curious about other contexts and their experiences and how that started, and if people were reluctant and why, and how these things were overcome and so on. So whoever has them, please share.
Ivana, I'm sorry, can I just add to your question? Antonia was mentioning this manual for tenants. And just aside from different, hopefully we will hear from Samuel and so, maybe also it would be nice to see how did tenants from Zagreb react. Do you think that there is a potential for establishing some kind of more massive front? So just to add to.
Sure.
Okay.
So I can talk about the New York experience. So there is definitely a culture of tenant politics, but that doesn't mean that most tenants are involved in formal organization. It's still a minority who are. I think that the biggest challenge is it's easiest to form a tenants union, like especially in the building or neighborhood level, when there is already a crisis. So like when the landlord is trying to raise the rents, or when there's a large number of evictions, or when there's a new development that's going to displace people. And the problem is you want the organization at that point to already exist so that it can react well to the external pressure. So sometimes it's sort of showing people that those things are possible in the near future that can get them to be involved. Obviously, the pandemic was a big spur. It made it harder to do in-person organizing, but more people lost work, were worried about eviction, had to fight for protections from the city, state, and national government. And so we saw a bunch more form. So the things to think about, I think, are first scale. So you can have a building level tenant organization, a neighborhood level tenant organization, citywide, national, regional, whatever. And I think our goal should always be the biggest scale, but you can work up to that. And then the second thing is this question of the state. So we have fully independent tenant organizations, and then we have others that are ostensibly independent but get funding from local government. And even from like the person who represents their very neighborhood. And there's something good about that. It's a stable source of funds for the most part. It's good that the public supports organizing. It's bad, however, when then the tenant organization basically can't do anything that their funder doesn't want. So if the funder supports the redevelopment scheme, the tenants organization doesn't, it's hard for them to challenge the local council member because that's their main source of funding. So there is a political dependency that can form, even though it's better to have the state funding you than fighting in the street.
You want me to quickly answer? Just from the Berlin experience a little bit. I mean, I think the main driver was just that the rents were too high. The rents were too high. So, and everybody agrees with that in Berlin. And that has a lot to do with actually the culture of the city being cool and livable, high quality of life place because it's not too expensive, right? Artists can go there, creative people can go there, they don't make a lot of money and can live a decent life in Berlin. That was always the promise, and that made it an attractive place. And when that started to change pretty radically with 20% rent increases per year, people were pissed off. And that was really driving the movement. And that was really, because they were not only saying rents are too high, but it's also, we don't want to be in a place where people that can't afford housing are driven out of the center. We don't want to be another Paris or another London. That was really the cultural, political mentality that went with it. And it got very politicized, because then they were talking about policies and legal frameworks to do it. But you need also, I think, what helped a lot, the left squatter scene in Berlin is like symbolic confrontational places. You need these very localized struggles actually to mobilize people and draw them in. For example, you had a few places in East Berlin that were, as you know, where people had to send in like hundreds of police to evict the squatters, and that became a symbolic fight. And I think, I've been in Belgium for 3 years, and Belgium waterfront was a symbolic struggle like that. I think if they would have destroyed Petzegrad and the whole street there, that might have had even bigger symbolic value, but they didn't go that far. But I think that it helps an awful lot to have these immediate evictions or confrontational moments where you mobilize a lot of people all of a sudden. And that's, but of course the structure in Belgrade is very different. I was, for example, hoping, but it didn't really happen, that when they announced the selling of Beeks, the big former, paper factory and huge vibrant cultural space, because it's space for creative production and bands and musicians basically, and because that has a lot to do with what we want to be as a city, right? Do we want to keep space for these kind of people inside the city, or do we want to privatize everything? And that can be one of these symbolic struggles, like where people say, hey, no, we don't want this to be in our name to be privatized, but it didn't mobilize yet so many people. But yeah, you need this anger of a critical mass of people that just say, no, that helps. Sorry for the channel.
Yeah, just to go back to what Stein mentioned, is easier for people mobilize when there is already a crisis, and we should have a model for a movement set up before that moment happens. And to go back to what Johanna said in the very beginning, that that these questions are not considered relevant in general public. So we will constantly wonder what are we doing here then. But I think that so if this is not thinking out loud. If right to buy solved the housing issue for one generation, we kind of know, we are guessing that this is expiring, the solution is expiring. So I wonder how can we show that? How can we prove, can we show how many young people right now can inherit their apartments? How many of them, we have some general numbers of how many of them live with their parents, but how can we make a stronger argument that the crisis is about to come? Because we are kind of feeling it already, but I think that's tough.
Maybe just add some. Yeah, what Sarah said is really, it's actually the kind of like the way how we should go. But I think there is another really potentially actually a big issue for us if we start doing that. It's that actually for the last 30 years at least, there was this constant narrative that if you cannot buy your own flat, you're a failure, actually. You can inherit, you can live as a tenant, or you can actually wait for, get a good job to get a loan, actually. There are actually the three main...
Well, you can build on your own on the city outskirts.
Yeah, like completely without any construction permits or without infrastructure at all. So these are actually models for solving the housing issue in the country. And I think if we start working with, young people and actually trying to demonstrate how many generations of young people will not be in the situation even to, will rent forever, in these circumstances actually where you don't even have the rent contract, it's really a huge issue. I think we also have to kind of like touch at least, well, not touch upon, but actually really see how should we actually discuss this problem that actually for 30 years someone is telling you your failure if you cannot have your own because everything is privatized, this is now the new world. So this is also this would be kind of like a method, I would say, like working with young people, but this kind of like more systemic issue is something that we also have to work on. I don't know how, but I don't know.
I think also, aside from this message that you mentioned, there is also like by making the tenancy insecure, you are also pushing everyone to buy it as a form of at least some basic existential security. So it's also like it works on a different level. I agree, but it's also like they push you by making precarious all other solutions, even the social housing as well. So you see the only way to have some kind of
moja kućica, moja slobodica.
Well, yes, I agree, and exactly this is the way the financial value is being extracted in this part of Europe, by making everybody pushing them into loans, because, well, of course, neoliberalism functions this way. It finds roots in every context, and here this is it, and it is as well, of course, a political decision. If you are shrinking every other possibility of resolving somebody's housing situation, even here in Croatia, but I guess in Serbia as well, this is by political structures. It's being related with our mentality, saying that we just lean to owning because we are used to it, but it's not true. Just 30 years ago, we were used to live in society, societal housing will be, we have been enjoying for 40 years before that. Now people, of course, people are forgetting, and we are having problems with mobilization here, because people are still these young generations. I don't know. I don't think they're aware. This is a social issue, social in terms of for all society. They are, everybody is perceiving. Most people are perceiving this as an individual failure, and your your bad status, tenancy status, and the fact you are not able to negotiate some good conditions with your landlord. People we have connection with are we're asking for advice, but still are not. They are thinking about it as an individual problem, and they are trying to solve it on the in the individual way. They are grateful for help, for advice, but they're not staying here longer and making I don't know. Willing to participate in some kind of community around this. We had problems with attracting bigger number of people before pandemic, when we organized a couple of workshops on tenant rights, and we managed to attract. Almost some, I don't know, a bit bigger circle of people we do know, but we didn't manage to reach some people we don't actually have contact with. And during the pandemic, with the urge to translate everything online, it was a bit enabling for us to reach a bigger amount of people in all Croatia, and it was cool actually, and we managed to shape a group that now numbers some 1,500 members, which is in the comparison with your tenant unions nothing, but it's the biggest step we did until now, and we are trying to use this channel to inform them. But I couldn't still stay. We have some kind of really stable community. It's not a community. And as well, we are really in need of knowledge, but specific to our context and to the needs, and to answer this. To answer how to really manage to connect people and to shape some kind of movement around this housing issue of new generation, and make them understand we cannot lean on the ownership. It's not our solution, and it's not the most stable way of securing your housing needs.
Antonio, can you tell me how does this, what you learned, now translates into, now that proportional is the city part of the city government has made, how does it translate into policies that are going to come up? I mean, what do you think would be the first steps, or what is realistic that can of the programs that you were thinking related to housing really come to reality?
This is really I wouldn't say a lucky situation, but because we are in the beginning of everything, and we have to try to see if this will work. But it has to do with planning, of course. Now we are in position of actually going into other direction with using the public land, which is I think it should and could could be a solution, using the public land for social good, and enabling a variety of non-profit housing schemes with the public resources. When by now in the former government, which was neoliberal at the same time, but corrupted and actually criminal, they used it as solution for indebted city. And they just it was a guarantee or really short-term solutions. They used to sell public land and ever more in the central areas, and especially now after the crisis after the last crisis related to COVID pandemic and the earthquake in Zagreb, the central areas in Zagreb became even more endangered by the perspective of selling it forever to the private investors, and the public housing which did exist in former city government schemes was never placed in the central, not in the central areas, but in the areas where where there is the public transport exists and the infrastructure exists. It was always at the outskirts of the city, and what we want to do now is to open the possibilities to use valuable land and spatial resources in the city for investing in public housing without the right to buy, and in cooperative housing and developing models of and informing people of the possibilities of taking part in resolving their housing issues in non-profit in non-profit models, and this way as well fighting the gentrification, but probably the first step should be organizing organizing some kind of probing of the needs, of the housing needs of the people in Zagreb, because we are not aware of it, because it's not being researched by any government so far. We don't actually know how much people is in need of more stable housing. We have some vague numbers of 25% of people between 18 and 39 years that are living in tenants in Zagreb, but this is not something we can take for serious. So we have to do it. We have to do it from scratch. This problem of housing need, and start from that and start building these policies based on using our common and public land for common good.
I have a question actually. So if we do succeed in seizing some public space and then we actually decide to use it for public housing, how do we fund it? Because you mentioned we as people, okay, or as organizations, okay, so we have to be then dependent, these organizations in which we are organized, tenants or general people, we are dependent on certain funds. We are dependent either on funds or some political parties, so we are dependent, and in that way could lose our goal, basically, because we play by someone else's rules. So I'm just asking, because money is money is in the way of actually building using public space for public housing. How do we solve that problem? How do we not depend on certain funds or political bodies?
Well, I don't know. For beginning in Zagreb, we just need to stop public investments in public housing in a corrupt way, because in the model that we used to have until now in this with this previous government, it was some model that was giving public land and public resources for building public housing, but made by a city company, which is some kind of partner to the city government, and assured with public money that the city of Zagreb got through loans, and after that just prescribed to this public company Zagrebačka stanogradnja, which means Zagreb Housing Company. They were assigned as owners, and the city of Zagreb then signed a contract that with a duration of 15 or 10 years, where the city of Zagreb is paying this public company the rent for these apartments that were built with the money financed by city of Zagreb by loans, and that's how it was a chain of a corrupt chain that managed to various times to pay for the built housing stock various times more than the real value, and this was the same model that every public investment was built in Zagreb, be it housing or sport infrastructure, I don't know, other types of public infrastructure, and I don't know. In the first place, we could, and we definitely will stop with this practice, which was really unbelievable and toxic, and used for a really limited groups. Used by limited groups of people who made money out of this. I don't think we could. Now in some, I don't know, short-term radical move from I don't know, from conventional loan system financing that, but we could at least be more responsible with using it, and with making a bigger, with making a higher amount of this public and societal housing, and involving bigger amounts of society to participate, and paying rent in that kind of housing stock, and I don't know, in some period will manage to make it more sustainable.